Hi, everyone who's starting to log in. We'll just give it a minute to give time for everyone to log in, and then we'll begin shortly.
Oh, wow, 84. It's like a little ticker on there. See how many people are signing on.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll have smart stuff to say.
I'm sure we will.
Do we have a straw poll on the number?
300.
300?
Wow.
300 or bust.
Yeah, like I can't really see you.
Oh, you can't see me? Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. I think we can kick it off.
Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Hello for this amazing ticking counter of people joining this webinar. We're so excited to be hosting Designing Your Odyssey and co-hosting really between Via and between IDEO's Co-Lab. We mostly want to take the start of this to welcome all of you and to thank you for spending your, in some places, late afternoon, evening, some places just afternoon, listening to us. We're excited to share some cool tips and tricks and exercises around making choices around career transitions. But one of the realizations we had in deciding to do this webinar was that this moment of transition and this moment of designing a career was something we had all faced, and I know something that many of you are facing. And it's kind of amazing that all of you guys are here and on this call and really thinking about the same question, which is, how do I design a meaningful career and therefore a meaningful life? That's really awesome. So excited to have all of you, so excited to have a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to IDEO's Co-Lab for co-hosting this with us. I'll walk you through briefly our agenda for today. So first we'll introduce ourselves and why we're doing this. Then we'll introduce the Odyssey concept and share a bit of what we've learned on the field. Then we'll dive into the actual workshop piece, which is a guided design thinking exercise on how to design your own Odyssey. We'll go through some takeaways and reflections, as well as next steps and how to take it from here. And finally, we'll have a live Q&A section for the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar. Just a briefer on logistics for the Q&A. You can submit any questions throughout the webinar at any point by using the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom panel. And when we get to the Q&A section at the end, we'll read out the most relevant, interesting questions and answer them live anonymously, so no worries on sharing your name there. And if we can't get to your questions during the webinar, we'll send you a note after the webinar is over to address any pending questions. We encourage you to submit questions about your own career journey and how you're thinking about things so that others can not only learn from your experience, but probably resonate a lot with what you're going through. And so with that, we'll kick it off. I will introduce, oops, sorry.
Went all the way to the end.
Went all the way to the end.
Spoilers.
Yep. Sorry. There we go.
There we go.
I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Maite. I'm one of the co-founders of Via.work, which, as many of you know, is a platform that connects professionals like all of you with high-growth, innovative, and mission-driven startups in more than 15 cities around the world, either for short-term, 2 to 3 month breaks from your current job, as well as permanent long-term positions. And kind of as Becca was mentioning before starting Via, my career took a lot of different turns, from Wall Street to design to entrepreneurship. And at some point, I decided to do an MBA to figure stuff out, thinking that at the end of my MBA, I would have it all super figured out and well laid out. And just so happened that that's not what happened during the MBA. And so instead of recruiting for other companies, we decided to launch Via to address precisely that navigation bit of careers. And the idea for this webinar was really born from hundreds of you on our platform who are here today, asking us for help and guidance in navigating changes and transitions and thinking about, what else is out there, what is my next step? And so super excited and most of all thankful for the 2 experts here who will be guiding the workshop piece.
Experts is a strong term for me. But hi, everyone. My name is Becca Carroll. I work in IDEO's Co-Lab, which, if you're not familiar, is IDEO's platform for collaborative impact. And so we're founded on this belief that we can do more together than we can alone. And that's true across businesses. That's true across individuals. But what I work on specifically is IDEO Co-Lab's portfolio in dynamic workforce, which is where we explore, prototype, build solutions to enable a workforce of the future that is dynamic, that can have meaningful, economically viable careers, that is kind of skilled for the future, that it has the compensation models that support the future, all that good stuff. But it's funny, when Maite was sharing her introduction, I was thinking about how many similarities there are between how both of our journeys played out. Before business school, was an entrepreneur. I had co-founded my own startup and went to business school thinking, okay, like that was an amazing experience, but I want to know what else is out there for me. And I'm sure by spending $200,000 and 2 years of my life, I will have an answer to what I want to be when I grow up. And unsurprisingly, I did not leave with an answer, but left with a number of amazing projects and amazing experiences, and ended up going to a Co-Lab Makeathon and had so much fun on that day working in that way that I took a little bit of a leap of faith and was maybe in the position that some of you guys are today, where I wasn't even sure if it was the right decision or how to even determine if it was the right decision, and leapt into the Co-Lab thinking, well, if this doesn't work, I'll have to figure something else out. And it ended up becoming an incredible, incredible opportunity for me. So that's me.
Wonderful. And my name is Susan O'Malley, and it's a great honor to be here. I'm rounding out the trio of people who got things they didn't expect at business school. And I started my career as an early employee of Google in Europe, and that's how I accidentally became an organizational designer and a director of talent, which is why I'm here with you today. So I'm working at IDEO Co-Lab as a director of talent, helping us find, attract, and engage world-class talent to come and work with us on all the super interesting problems that Becca just mentioned. I've also done a lot of work as an IDEO consultant, as an organizational designer, helping really established big companies try on new processes and behaviors and to bring design thinking into the large organizations that they are trying to keep healthy and alive.
Awesome. Thank you. So with that, we will kick it off. And the first thing we want to mention is, well, why an Odyssey? And so take a moment of pause to think about what brings you to this webinar today. Each one of you is completely different. You all come from different countries, unique backgrounds, different career experiences, different aspirations. But the one thing that we think brings you all together today is that you are all in this point of navigation, looking out into your future, maybe approaching a turning point, maybe a change, maybe not at all, with a lot of different alternatives in front of you, a lot of learnings from your past, and thinking, well, how do I take my career from here? And so the word Odyssey we thought was really fitting, because you're on this journey that is, first of all, very meaningful. It's an epic, legendary, one-of-a-kind journey that is your career and your life. It's full of uncertainty. It isn't linear. You don't know necessarily where you're going to end up, what highs and what lows you'll find along the way, who you will cross paths with, and what kind of adventure you're in for. And we realize that it might feel for a lot of you like a very big deal, a lot of big decisions and big questions in front of you. And the idea is that in moments like this one that are full of thrill and possibility and uncertainty, active design is actually a really helpful tool to navigate that odyssey. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Susan.
Awesome. So to dive a little bit deeper into why we think this can be a helpful activity in this moment of change or exploration for you all, this really comes from an insight we have working, coaching individuals and organizations, where sometimes when we want to chart a course and set a plan, we feel this burden of weight and expectation that we have to have some grand vision, that we should wake up in the middle of the night and that this image will come to us as fully formed. And both from our own experience and also from research about creativity and problem solving, that's frankly just not how it works. The truth is that when we make progress in life and work, and today we're going to talk about those two things in tandem, it usually involves both a healthy degree of intention and focus, as well as serendipity and embracing of the unknown. And that's why we have this photo of the boat on the stormy ship here. And so what we're talking about here today is the fact that we can use active design as a way to help us lean into this problem. One of my favorite quotes about design comes from a very famous computer scientist and philosopher. Perhaps some of you know him, Herbert Simon. And he says that whenever we shape the world to meet our needs, we are designing. And so today we're going to talk a lot about the tools of design thinking and the mindsets, how to be optimistic, how to embrace the unknown, and the idea that there isn't any one path that's going to lead us to the straight answer. So your takeaway from this slide should be that we contain multitudes, and today we're here to embrace those multitudes and to explore some of the many best lives that you could be living. There's no one single right answer that will move us forward.
So I can talk a little bit about within the Co-Lab, what we know from looking out into the research about the future of work, but I thought I would actually start this with a little bit of a story of not just my career, but the different career paths taken by my family. Because I had this interesting realization a few weeks back that my dad, my grandfather, and I have all served on panels talking about the future of work, which is just kind of ridiculous when you think about it, but work is it's this great equalizer. It's something we all do. And it's something that regardless of how much money we make or what our role is, we feel an obligation to design for ourselves. And one of our realizations in the Co-Lab, which starts with research, really, and starts with looking out into the world about what are the changes that are happening, is that work is changing for all of us in much more rapid cycles, where my grandfather had one job. He worked with one organization from when he graduated college until he retired. My dad had 5 different organizations that he affiliated with over the course of his career for 10, 15 years. But for many of us, we're approaching our careers in an episodic way. We're expecting to affiliate with organizations, but mostly we're expecting to do series of projects. And those might be with one organization, those might be with many organizations. And I should caveat all that by the fact that we are, all of you guys here in this room, we're incredibly privileged to be having this conversation. We're incredibly privileged to be thinking about how work is going to change and how we can be a part of shaping that change. I don't think that's true for everybody. While I think that these tools could be used by anybody and in any situation, we're really fortunate to have actually an array of choices. And so as we look at some of the macro changes that are shifting, we are now left with, within these choices, how do we make the, in big air quotes, right one? So big changes that we're really starting to see. First of all, I mean, you can't have a conversation about the changing landscape of work without talking about technology. Many of us are expecting that the what of what we do is going to change, that we are going to be collaborating with machines in novel ways, that we are going to be changing our roles more constantly, that the actual act of what is our job is going to look different, not just in 40 years, but actually in 3. We're also starting to see a big change in who we work for. So there's a lot of think pieces, things like that written about the gig economy. But part of what we're starting to see is that there's a big shift to project-based work. So I think this is a Department of Labor statistic, 30% of Americans are engaging in project-based work. That might be everything from being a TaskRabbit to being a Via fellow and anything in between. And that puts all these new questions and kind of open design space to a lot of the structures that we've thought of as historically underlying work. That's everything from benefit structures to how we think about mentorship to how we think about management. The last stat on here actually blows my mind. It's about the change in our compensation structures. I want to be really clear here. Work is something we do for money. If we wanted to do it for free, we probably wouldn't call it work. But we're starting to think about compensation more expansively, and the shift is somewhat generational. This is an article that came out of Harvard Business School that found that 40% of Americans would take a pay cut in exchange for, or 90%, I'm sorry, well, 90% of Americans take a pay cut in exchange for more meaningful work. And that was true across the economic spectrum. And that pay cut on average was $23,000. So a huge amount of money. So we're starting to think about the value we expect to get back from our work as being about more than just money. And all of these things, these are macro level shifts, right? So it's hard to individualize them, but what they really point at is that the future of work is something that we can and need to design and need to develop tools to design much more iteratively.
Awesome. So what do we know more kind of on the ground from hearing to the thousands of you who are on our platform and the hundreds of you who we talk to every day applying to all these projects all over the world is, I would summarize it into 4 main things. The first is we're realizing again that transitions are becoming the norm. Whether you're looking for a short break from your existing career to do something different and then come back, or you're looking to transition altogether across different jobs, roles, and companies, this is becoming a lot more the usual. Again, your career is not one straight line, but rather it's played out in episodes or modules, as Becca was saying. Second, that our priorities we hear are shifting, right? The way our generation thinks about work is fundamentally different. We have very high expectations for what we're doing within our work and the feelings that it provides to us. We seek globality, we seek meaning, we seek impact. And eventually we get to see work as an experience that plays into our life, right? So work really as an experience, which leads us to believe at Via that designing your work is really about designing your life. If you think about it, you will spend 40% of your remaining time awake in the world at work. So when we talk about what we do at work, what we're really talking about is how are you going to design the days in your life? And how do you design work as something that enables you to live the life you want to live, to have the impact and experiences that you want to have in the world? And that's the underlying question we're trying to get at with this Odyssey exercise. Finally, the last takeaway is we've realized that you're not alone. There are thousands of people like you that are asking themselves these same questions, and that's the community that we want to create behind Via.
Great. So with that, we'll segue into the workshop part of the activity. As some of you might know, one of our values here at IDEO is talk less, do more. So while still talking together, we're going to try and do some more. And so we're going to roll up our sleeves and start to actually design together. Now, we have some materials on some of our processes and best practices from design thinking that we'll share with you all after the call. But for our time together today, there's 1 or 2 that we'd like to focus on in particular. And so these come from our rules of brainstorming. If you have a pen and paper handy, this would be a great time to jot down the 2 that you can see on the left of the screen. And so the 2 rules that we'd really like you to try and embody for the remainder of the hour are, first of all, deter judgment. So we're going to guide you through a process where we're going to try to generate a lot of new ideas very quickly. And the thing we'd love you to try and believe is that there are no bad ideas at this point in time. There's plenty of time to judge later, so please try to be gentle with yourself and defer judgment as you're generating ideas. The second brainstorm rule is to encourage wild ideas. It is the wild ideas that we explore and the ideas in between ideas and the ideas at the edge of ideas that really often lead to the breakthroughs. And so like a classy pair of jeans, it's way easier to dial it down later, but very hard to dial it back up if you don't start well. So encourage wild ideas and defer judgment is what we're hoping you can try on as a new sort of muscle for the next half hour. So into the meat of the activity itself, we are going to work on an exploration map, and this is pretty simple. As Maite already suggested, the future often works well when we break it down into a series of sequential steps that lead to a future. And so the 5 buckets that you can see ahead of you can represent quarters of a year, months, different periods in time that build on each other. And so we're going to move through this together in a moment with an example from Becca. And the other thing we want you to do for each of these maps when we create them is try and think of a 6-word catchy title. So engage your inner advertising copywriter, think of a corny brand, or if this was a song or a movie, what would I call it? And think of a title, and that'll help us identify the different maps that we're making as we go through this. Okay, and we'll illustrate this again in a moment with the example, but the way that we're going to approach generating the different odysseys that you might embark on is a pretty powerful structure that we found is very good at generating lots of different options. And so here's the 3 paths that we're proposing that we can create together. The first path is imagining that we play out the existing path that we're already on. So there may be a world or a context or a skill or a situation that you're in today. Imagine that you continue to be really engaged with that and love it and become hyper successful. What are all the things that could be possible if we play out that path and continue to follow it? The second path is what we call the vanishing option. And this one goes in a radically different direction. Imagine all the stuff on path 1, all the things that you assumed or that you took for granted. Imagine they just vamoose, they're gone. They're no longer possible. What is another path that you can imagine being accessible to you in a world where most of the stuff in path 1 didn't exist anymore? And it doesn't matter here, whatever you need to think about to get you in the mood for path 2, if it's zombies, robots, nuclear apocalypse, hopefully it's not those things, but think pretty drastically here in terms of some kind of situation that might drastically change. And the third path is what we often call the purpose path, and this is really the no constraints path, where if constraints such as time, money, fixed assumptions about your life, if they were less of an issue, what are some of the things that you might explore that would be a little bit radical? On this one, I really want to underscore something that Becca said earlier on, which is that for many of us, this is not a viable path to explore in the longer range. So we're purely doing this from a thought activity. Most people have very real needs in terms of income, housing, immigration, and so on and so forth. So oftentimes this one can be a little bit uncomfortable to lean into. But what we're trying to do here with path 3 is both be conscious of those things and also free ourselves up to say, which are the assumptions that might not be as fixed as we think they are.
And Susan, this exercise comes from some work done at Stanford, right?
That's correct, yes. There's a version of this activity in an outstanding book that was a New York Times bestseller a couple of years ago called Designing Your Life, which is a program that 2 professors at the D School coached thousands of undergraduate and graduate students through at Stanford. And so some of this material is based on that content, and it's also based on many other forms of design thinking content, which is open and public source, and which is also based on our work here at IDEO.
All right, so I believe we're going to dive into some of the workshop piece, and you guys should feel free as you're listening to us kind of demo this live on screen to be sketching down your own versions of this. This is illustrative and hopefully an example. I will acknowledge that I raised my hand and volunteered to be the guinea pig to do this live in front of hundreds of you. So remember what Susan said about deferring judgment, please.
Yeah, we encourage you to grab a piece of paper and start jotting some ideas out. You can do this as many times as necessary. For those of us who aren't designers in our full-time jobs, it might be hard to do at the beginning, which, to be honest, when I did this in prep for this session, it can be a bit awkward. But again, lean into that, and you can always have another new journey map where you are a completely different person. So have fun with it.
Yeah, I'll stop stalling in a second, but I will acknowledge that I had never done this exercise before we started prepping this workshop, and I'm very excited to hear what Susan has made of my answers. But it was a really illuminating exercise for me, but felt, to Maite's point, somewhat uncomfortable. Felt like, oh wow, here are all these things I don't yet know. And I had this moment as I was drawing out my 3 Odysseys where I was like, well, that's actually the purpose. Like, the purpose of any prototype is to break the prototype. And so hopefully that is what you guys will see is 3 broken prototypes of mine that I'm happy to walk you through. So Susan, is the best way for me to do this to just go through each one and kind of just talk through my own thinking?
Yeah, so I think if you tell us the title and then start at square 0, and it looks like there's a bit of a stream of consciousness thing going on here. So I think it would actually be very helpful for our guests if you actually just walk us through your thought process in terms of what's here.
Oh, you mean you can't tell from my bad art and words? So I named this one, Path 1, as a reminder, was the play out the path you're already on. So I named this one the T-shaped juggler, which wasn't 6 words, but then I added some words and I was like, well, that just ruins the title. So I leaned into no one done is done. So this is playing out, I'm in a role that I love, and I am learning so much. So what does it mean to just project that into the future? And so right now I am very humbly and authentically playing many different roles within the Co-Lab. I'm working on 2 different portfolios. I'm working on some of our early stage innovation processes. And that's creating a lot of value for me in terms of stretching and growth. But it's also making me feel like it's hard to go deep. So IDEO talks a lot about T-shaped people who are really horizontally broad and engaged, but can develop a level of depth within some area. And one of the places that I've been feeling like, okay, as I move forward in my career, I'd really like to be able to do is to develop more depth around a specific content area and to not just be playing across many, but be able to go really deep into one. And so as I was thinking about kind of this first time scale, I was thinking about, what are some of the ways that I could do it? Certainly focusing in on one portfolio of work is a big piece of that. But also I wanted to push myself to say, I think immediately what I would start to do is more writing, more sharing, more public putting of myself out there to say, hey, I'm here and I'm working on this stuff. And I think it's interesting. And you see all these like little drawings of people, because I was trying to get at there that like, what I don't think goes away is I think I'm still working really closely with people. And hopefully as I move into the second year, I was interpreting these as years. I don't know if that was the correct way to interpret them. But I was starting to push within that depth, actually starting to put more things into the world and enable people to put more things into the world. Mm-hmm. And the idea there was to really feel like I finally hit this balance, which is probably an ever-evolving thing in my career, of doing good and doing well. It's always been really important to me to be building and working on things that I thought were ultimately good for people. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I'm, a capitalist. I went to business school. So I wanted to figure out, like, how do we actually really think about ventures as a tool for impact? How do I think about, doing well for myself in the context of making an impact for people? And I kind of imagined in year 3 was really a stretch year for me as a leader, where I feel like I'm doing well and I feel like I'm starting to get some level of external recognition, and I can start to move into some of the coaching and leading. This is a little bit of a snarky title of how to run the world, but one of the things I've enjoyed the most in my role here is getting to work with so many of our student fellows and getting to not just share our innovation process, but like help them think through how they're approaching their own careers. And I would love to figure out how I find this right balance, especially by year 4, I guess, of coaching and leading and actually creating and launching things, because I think all of those are passion areas for me, with the hope that actually by year 4, I'm almost back in the same circular position that I am, where I have so many amazing, mind-bending things that I want to go make with so many amazing people. And it's just been a deepening and then a reopening of the design space that I operate in. So that's my current option, play it out. Potentially really vague, definitely broken in a few places.
Awesome. But boosh, it's no longer possible.
Boosh, no longer possible.
Talk to us about your vanishing option.
So my vanishing option, as you see my BIDEO email, it's right at the top. And then I had Mai Tais on the beach, because I was like, probably in my vanishing option, if I was like, hey, goodbye IDEO, I would take a little bit of a vacation. This one was the hardest for me, to be honest, to write. And I'm curious, actually, for many of you guys, if that's also the case. It felt reasonably easy for me to just remove all constraints and say, what would I do if like nothing was an issue? It felt actually really hard to say, if I had to not do this thing that I'm really enjoying, what is the other thing that I would also be really enjoying? Mm-hmm. Part of that is because I think sometimes that IDEO Co-Lab ruins you for all other jobs. But part of that is because to this point of really enjoying broadening the design space of many things I can do, it is really hard for me to choose and zero in. So I wrote this one about one that I've been thinking a lot about as of late, which is, if I weren't to be here, where would I be? And one of the passion areas of mine is really thinking about, in this moment of technology doing all these things that we hate as a society, really thinking about how do you make tech platforms more human-centered, not user-centered. Mm-hmm. It's a content area that I think I nerd out a lot about, and sometimes shows up in my work in the Co-Lab. But I think it's something that I could actually be really happy doing at a name your favorite big tech platform. And so I wrote this little diagram on the bottom where I was like, I could see myself actually really enjoying playing a role that sat at the intersection of biz ops, policy, design, product, and really thinking about how do you actually make whatever this product or service is, whatever this platform is, truly human and society centered, and design it in a way that it's actually delivering value back to the society it operates in. And that's super vague, but I can think of lots of specific examples of how you might do that within Facebook or Google or what have you. But I was like, that could actually bring me a lot of the same level of satisfaction I have at the Co-Lab on the heart side, while enabling me to do this opportunity, or to have this opportunity to spot patterns across different stakeholders who have their own kind of view of the world, mm-hmm. and say, hey, I'm actually sitting in between all you guys, and I can see this thing that we should all be working on together. Mm-hmm. You see this group of rockstar team. I think team is probably something that's true across both of these. And hopefully it's something that's just like really stretching me to feel like this is really scary. At the Co-Lab, we're building prototypes, but we don't have the reach of like a huge tech platform that is affecting millions or billions of participants. And so I imagine that by year 2 or 3, it's starting to feel authentically like somewhat overwhelming and a little bit scary, but also hopefully in a good way, feeling like a roller coaster where I'm driving impact through quick experiments and new things, but I'm on sort of an overarching upward trajectory. And I think this will start to feel a bit like I'm having some of this impact, but I'm actually starting to have to play in some of the politics and policy that I've not really built depth in through my work in the Co-Lab, but I have a lot of desire to build more capability in. I named this one Better Tech for People by People. It was going to be for the people by the people, but then it was too many words. This one had a terrible title because I was almost out of my time box. But for number 3, which was the no constraints option, can be anything. I actually, when I was in college, majored in creative writing, which I think surprises a lot of people because while I do a lot of writing in my job, people are like, oh, you didn't major in engineering or business or something that seems logical and linear. I have always loved to write fiction specifically since I was a little kid. And part of the reason I majored in that in college is I was like, I don't know if this is a viable career path, and therefore I don't know when else in my life I'll get to deeply focus on this. And so as I thought about this no constraints option, I was thinking really specifically about what would it mean to pursue creative writing as my career path? And what would it mean to actually finish that novel that I've been working on for 10 years and rarely makes progress? And so I actually imagined it starts with 2 things. First was rereading everything. I have bookshelves full of things that I love to read, and I had time and space once upon a time in college to be deep in the art of writing that has sort of gotten away from me. And so one of the first things I'd want to do is actually build out some of that time and space. And the second thing I'd want to do almost right away is start to build a community around writing. Writing can be really solitary, and I know that I actually don't work well when I just have to be alone all the time. And so that might involve joining crit groups, joining workshops, but really be revising. And I imagined actually year 1 was a rough year. Part of the reason that I didn't pursue this full time was it's a lot of rejection. Like, this says 10 plus no's for every yes. I think it's actually probably 100 plus. But I would want to really be pushing myself, especially in year 1, to be putting my stuff out there. That's been the hardest piece for me when I don't have the time or space to make my writing perfect, to feel like I'm getting it out into the world, sharing it with journals, trying to get it published, trying to get other people's eyes on it. It's ironic because it's sort of the opposite of my work at Co-Lab, which is like share something sacrificial. My writing has always felt like something that's a lot harder for me to do. And so in year 1, I'd really like to build that muscle. By year 2, I would love to have a feedback community of writers that I'm working with. And that might mean collaborating on pieces. That might just mean working with one another to give feedback to one another, to help each other, to push each other, to just like make this isolative process feel more community-based. Very tactically, I would love to have my first draft of the novel like done and ready for sharing. By year 3, one of the things I've always enjoyed at Co-Lab that I would love to build into this open space career was the opportunity to teach and build with people. So I saw myself as actually starting to teach classes, starting to share some of the real things that I have written out in the world and like put those out and have people react to them and hopefully have gotten a few yeses from all those many no's. And hopefully like have a book deal at that point, like actually have my book be either on route to publication or already published. I hear on Amazon you can self-publish, so maybe this hurdle is lower than I'm thinking of. And by year 4, what I really wanted to build towards and what I dreamed of was making a level of space for just open creativity. So sharing the project that I was on, but really being in this exploratory phase of what do I do next? What is the next book that I write? What is the next piece that I'm working on? What should I be pushing? And so those are my 3 odysseys. Don't tear them apart. It's very scary to share them. I empathize with all of you as you guys hopefully go off and do these afterwards because it's very nerve-wracking.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing so openly. I've shared some of these maps in public too, and it's been a very humbling, engaging experience. So we're going to sort of transition into sort of a reflecting coaching moment. Maite and myself are going to sort of engage a little bit with some of what Becca put out there. We're also going to talk a little bit later on about a worksheet we have if you'd like to do this with each other or back with your organizations or teams. So first of all, Becca, how did this feel? Like, I'm curious what this kicked up for you. Was there anything that was really surprising, interesting? Talk to us about that in terms of zooming out and reflecting.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it was hard for me. I have always been, I don't want to say like opportunistic, but I feel like I've often been like, oh, this is an interesting thing. And I like to follow my nose and just be like, hey, here's a thing. And so articulating, particularly with the time scales and getting to a level of specificity was tough. And even though I knew it was like, I literally wrote it in pencil to convince myself like, it's not final, like it's not fixed, it's fine. But it felt really nerve-wracking, like every time I got to that next open space. And actually the second one for me, the vanishing option was the hardest. I actually spent like 15 minutes just reading job postings because I was like, I don't even know, like, what would I be doing if it wasn't this? I like honestly don't have a good sense of it. Which was interesting because it actually pushed me to articulate something that's been in my head for a while, which is like this path that I actually see being a really good fit for me or creating value for me that I had never really made sense of to myself. And then my other big takeaway was I actually think it highlighted some of the things I want to approach about my current role, like how to actually think about where I need to be making shifts that will bring me more happiness or purpose.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we'll transition to Maite in a second for some other observations, reflections, but I want to touch on something that Becca's already hit on, which is often across the three maps, even though they'll be quite different, there are already tensions and patterns forming that might be explicitly connected to the content, but also might be a little bit more indirect or implicit in terms of things that are emerging. So just for example, to call out one that I'm thinking I heard or saw, you know, in all of the maps, but in 1 and 3 in particular, you have a very strong sense of motivation toward having an impact in the world. So these are incredibly ambitious, societally orientated things that you're hoping to achieve, which is awesome. And I think it's partly why you chose to come to IDEO and to Co-Lab, is that it's a place where people who can want to try and help others achieve these things can do that. But there was an interesting tension or trade-off that I was hearing in terms of the amount of focus and depth required to express or make some of these ideas versus the kind of interdisciplinary, you know, multi-team aspect for it. And so interestingly, in number 2, you pretty quickly identified your interaction with the team and the need for a rockstar team and either being on or leading or guiding a team as a proof point. But in 1 or 3, there's probably a lot to explore around, well, what is the role of a team? And if I'm going to be the person, you know, sitting heads down and creating that awesome content or groundbreaking idea, like how am I going to have the energy to interact with others? So if we were doing a more a deeper working session on this, that's an example of the thing that I might probe on with you. The other thing I want to highlight is that Becca also mentioned that some of these ideas had been things she'd been kicking around for a while. What I love about this activity is that you very quickly realize that even though something feels like a big idea in your mind, there's actually not a lot of detail there yet. And so even the very act of thinking through the detail helps us understand what other questions we have, what are better questions we could answer, but also really importantly, just how energized we are by something or not. So a lot of this isn't scientific, it's not quantitative. Even in hearing Becca walk us through some of these explorations, I think it was pretty fair to say that there were a lot of points where she was very excited and we could tell she had a really natural energy. And some of them were already starting to feel like a bit of a drag and a bit of a strain, even though this was just a fictional game.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting was there's a lot of like enabling actions or words around all 3 of your journeys. So at the Co-Lab, it's enabling like more things to come into the Co-Lab, enabling like when you were a teacher in one of the journeys, enabling others to learn. In the For People, by the People, it was enabling others to use that technology. So I thought it was interesting how those things happen kind of towards like later on, almost as if like first I have to accomplish more depth, as you were saying, and then kind of enable others versus maybe earlier on in the journeys.
Yeah. I think you guys hit on like real things that like I don't have answers to them, But I think the value for me of this exercise was like in trying to flesh them out. One thing we didn't talk about is I like discarded like 10 before I landed on these. I mean, I don't know if I like wrote out the whole thing all the way through, but like I actually went through a couple where I was like, oh no, this feels wrong. And I printed out like 6 versions of the sheet and I was like, okay, great. Like that one is like one lost to the wind to get to these. Not saying that these are right, because I think there's actually a whole bunch that's incorrect in all of these. But it kind of was this interesting moment of really starting to zero in on the possibility that each one enables and trying to figure out, like, is that possibility something I'm excited about?
Awesome.
As we transition to kind of more of the takeaways, one question that I had, Susan, is, or Becca, so we map these out and we kind of go on these crazy journeys, and we have our pieces of paper, some of the stuff we like, some of the stuff we feel weird about, but whatever. And then next day comes and kind of like, what do you do with this would be my transition question
Absolutely.
for the next slide.
And we have 2 suggestions, although there may be other great suggestions that arise from the audience on the session here. So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite methodologies for constructing new strategies and exploring the future, and then Becca will also dive into it. So one of the questions that I've been using when we do this activity is to ask the question, what would need to be true? So for any given moment in any of the futures, looking at that situation and saying, what would need to be true for this to be a viable option, for this to be realistic, for this to work? And this is a very simple but powerful question. We can't claim credit for it ourselves. It actually comes from a very impressive strategic thinker, probably one of the top strategists in the world, a gentleman named Roger Martin, and he writes about this in his in many of his books, and in his book Playing to Win, that he co-authored with the former CEO of AG Lafley. And really this question came into being as a tool to have a conversation about a difficult situation where there may be lots of different perspectives in the room. So in this case, Roger tells a story about trying to make a decision about a mine that was going to be either very expensive if they shut the mine down versus very impactful for a community if they made that choice. And so in order to have a very real constructive dialogue with people who were on completely different pages, they went around and asked the question, what would need to be true? And so this is a powerful question because you can ask it about any element of the situation in these pictures, right? You could ask it about the company, the economic context, your personal life, where you live or work, what is the product that company is selling. In a business context, you could ask it about the competitive environment, about the customers, about the product, about regulation, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we'll often do is we'll ask a bunch of what would need to be true questions, we'll list them all out, and then we'll come back and have a very good hard look at of those things that would need to be true, which ones really, really must be true. And this is kind of an alternative way of prototyping where we can prioritize the questions that we really, really need to go and learn about quickly. So my favorite thing about this tool is that it takes something that can be a difficult or stressful context, right, where people might be combative or they might have difficult posture, and it really flips it into a more constructive way where we say, let's imagine a future where we've been successful, and let's talk about what's going on there. And there's specifically a very short one-page article that we can send around. It's a great read, and this is a very useful tool that you can apply inside of your organizations.
The other big, hopefully, takeaway you can take from this is actually specifically about prototyping. So what would need to be true is about helping you articulate hypotheses. Prototyping is a life skill to figure out if those hypotheses are right or wrong. So unsurprisingly, at IDEO, we really believe in prototypes, everything from duct tape together, whiteboard markers, and clothespins turning into medical devices, to pretty much anything you can imagine. I think people have this view that a prototype has to be a product, or it has to be something that's going to become a venture. But actually, we believe you can prototype anything. And I want to come back to one of the things Susan was sharing about actually putting these maps out there brought up all these new possibilities or new opportunities. One of the things I think a lot about is that when you're at the idea stage, it's really easy to just see the risks. It's really easy to just see all the reasons that something isn't going to work. And that's true if you're launching a venture, that's true if you're deciding your next step in your career. But when you start to prototype, that's actually this unlock moment in your brain to start to see possibilities. And to start to say, hey, I tried this out in a really small scale or in a really analogous context, and all these pieces didn't work, it wasn't perfect. But now I see all these different possibilities that I could go after. I have a different design space. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a few things to think about that are pretty critical with prototyping as a life skill. The first is that, prototypes are meant to be broken. And so I think there's a lot of pressure in any career transition, in any Odyssey, to make the right choice. But if you approach these questions as, I'm going to prototype, I'm going to be wrong. I know it's going to be wrong. I know it's going to be wrong in all these different ways. But I'm going to learn in what ways it's wrong, and that's going to set me directionally to the place that it's going to be right. And the second thing I think you should think a lot about, or I think a lot about, is how you can build in more rapid or iterative cycles. There's a lot of pressure on these decisions to be forever decisions. Mm-hmm. In fact, the research shows that they're not, that we are not going to be on these projects or these opportunities for 35 years. Mm-hmm. So take some of the pressure off, but think about how you can build in shorter scale prototypes. The tangible example for me when I graduated from business school is I joined the Co-Lab as a summer fellow. And that was super scary because I had a lot of loans and I didn't have a full-time job at the end of my fellowship. But I was like, I'm going to prototype this out in this next moment of my career because I think I'm going to learn something. I have this hypothesis about the way I like to work, and I'm going to run this prototype and figure out if it's right or wrong.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we like to tell you when we have conversations with many of you is a less risky way of prototyping is also to speak to people who are doing things that are on other paths, right? Even before you dive and completely transition to something different, how can you get as closer to that experience as possible, and diving into more conversations, seeing what maybe some peers of yours are doing, things like that can, again, get you closer to one of those journeys.
Mm-hmm. I'll also toss one more thing in there, which is that these are prototypes. I know they're written in pencil and have a lot more questions in it, but these are my first prototypes in terms of what I think my Odyssey could be. Mm-hmm. And so treat them that way, treat them like prototypes, take the pressure off, but get them past the idea stage and into something you can act on or learn from.
If I could share one final thought on this slide, perhaps wedding these two ideas together, it's that the idea that a prototype is a way to manufacture data that doesn't yet exist. Very often with prototypes, we're engaging other people. We're literally trying to create new evidence or form a better hypothesis that can move us forward. And I think specifically the what would need to be true question is a great way to engage other people in that dialogue with you. For example, I recently coached a friend and her husband trying to make a decision where she did a bit of a ninja move and used this question on her husband to find out in his version of her future career what would need to be true for him for this to be awesome. And that's something that it would be very easy for us to overlook, but they actually were able to arrive at some great design choices for their life that made something possible that they felt had been constrained before.
Awesome. So your assignment now is to ideate like your life depends on it, which is no pressure, but happy prototyping. We will be sharing the actual the time horizon in PDF format for you guys to print out and work on. And the next takeaway is actually on coaching and how to find someone to help you. Susan, do you want to go through what it looks like to share your journey with someone else?
Yeah, absolutely. So often when we do this activity together and we're offering to do it virtually for you over the coming weeks, we pair people up with a coach or guide. And this is really somebody who can display the attributes of a great coach. So obviously many coaches have a lot of training and fancy degrees and a high price tag, but frankly, most of us can actually be helpful to each other if we adopt the approaches of a coach. And so, for example, some of what we were doing here today with Becca and what we would do if we were doing this with a client is we were displaying curiosity, we were listening deeply, we were trying to hear for nuance, and we were really just holding space for others. We were helping them work through something together. We weren't attached to any outcome, and we were trying to make them successful. And so this is a very simple framework that we've developed that can be a guide for anybody to be a great coach. And so we've got different questions here that move between the heart, the gut, and the mind, where if one of your friends or colleagues was going through this activity, you could set it up for a great conversation to really help them reflect and to activate them.
And on that point, we will help you if you want to take this further and apply for peer coaching, meaning if you want to be matched with someone else who's on this webinar to be like peer-to-peer coaching, we'll send you an email after the webinar with all of the resources, the materials that we shared, some references, and then if you're interested in being matched with someone for a 30-minute peer coaching session, it'll be someone that you probably don't know who has some relevance to your career or not. Again, we'll send you more information about that, but I encourage you all to sign up for that.
And I'll say that I think it is worthwhile to do this activity and then try to be coached by somebody, both because it, I think, surfaces things that you probably don't see because you're so deep in it, but also because, like, to this point of experts and more points of view, like, it might give you new ideas for things you could pursue.
Absolutely.
And so I think this is really worthwhile, and I'm actually really bummed that because there are so many of you, we couldn't do this live alongside you, but it would have been just like a lot of silence on a phone call while people were writing down things. So I really encourage you guys to do this because I think I actually learned a lot about my 3 journeys, even with this like mini session version that we tried. And also I'm sort of excited about the idea of like I could coach someone else, even if I don't feel super, I don't have all the fancy degrees and all that good stuff, but I think it might actually help me learn a little bit on me too.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Just to conclude before we walk into Q&A, well, first of all, congratulate you all on diving into this and hopefully beginning your first prototypes of your Odysseys. We really hope that you take this as the first time of a series of times in which you will revisit this exercise and similar exercises. Again, we'll share the diagram and the references and all of that. And in conclusion, remember the thing that I learned in my time at IDEO is that everything you do in the world and everything you see in the world can be designed. So really to take an active perspective in how you think about your careers is the way forward. And to thank Susan and Becca for taking their time and their experience and sharing that with all of us.
Thank you, Maite.
Thank you, Maite, for
making this happen.
So now we'll dive into Q&A. The way the Q&A will work is we've been receiving questions from all of you throughout the webinar. We have around 10 minutes or so, so anything that we don't get to now, we will definitely shoot you an email after the webinar and answer any questions. For that, Becca, if we could just change seats so that I can look at the Q&A button. Sorry. Thank you. And I'll just redirect them to both of you.
Oh, great. So you don't have to answer them?
No. Yeah, so we're getting interesting insight on how do you overcome the internal and external inertia of leaving a good job for the hope of a better one? That's an interesting question.
The grass is greener. This might feel like a cop-out answer, but I actually think the answer is prototyping. Like, I think it's really easy to feel frustrated and like deep in the day-to-day and feel like, almost like a little burdened by that. Like, I can't even think about what might change, right? I don't even have the brain space to think about what might be better. And the honest answer, which isn't super compelling, is like, if it is important to you and it's something that you really want, you need to define what better means to you, and the way that you define what better means to you and whether other organizations can provide it is actually by trying to prototype it. And that might take the form of this exercise, that might take the form of sitting down and having coffee with people at that organization, that might take the form of a what would need to be true exercise of like, hey, like, if I project myself in the future, what would need to be true for me to have been happy at this current job versus the new job? But that's kind of my point of view on it.
Just that makes a ton of sense, and we're on the same page. I think the one build I would have is that there's a really important tension here between safety and risk, right? Taking a leap into the unknown, making a step forward. And so I think trying to have an honest conversation with yourself or with a friend or a coach who can say, okay, well, you're leaving, maybe company X or a government job, whatever you're leaving, and if we wanted to go back there or we get that job or get an equivalent job, like, how hard is that going to be? Do we know how hard that's going to be? Like, if something didn't work or something bad happened in our personal lives and we were unfortunate, like, do we understand our options? Having a clear perspective on the option set can actually empower you to take bigger leaps of faith because you understand the environment you're in. So we don't want anybody to go out and do anything crazy. We don't want them to, there are very real needs that people have in terms of health and stability and a lot. So I think, as Becca says, prototyping it incrementally is important, and also trying to have a very open sense of like, what's actually possible for me in the future. That can really take the temperature down, I think, and make this a little bit more manageable for a lot of people.
Can I build on that? Because I actually think when I see folks do that, and I think those constraints are real and you shouldn't lose them, but a lot of people feel a lot of weight about the risk of moving to something new, and they don't actually take some time to articulate themselves the risks of staying.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a really worthwhile activity to do, particularly when you're in that inertia moment of, well, what would be true if I just stayed here?
Yep.
And not, what would I be giving up, but would I become bored? Would I become bitter? Would I become all these things I don't want to be? And is that a risk I'm actually taking on by not prototyping a new, better job? Big air quotes there.
Well, interesting. A lot of questions around like the concept of taking a leap of faith and taking that risk versus the prototype, which is more kind of in theory. So any advice on better prototyping, how you would feel taking that leap? Any advice overall on prototyping? Seems to be a common question.
Prototyping is scary. Like, I don't mean to say that it's not. It's scary if it's like a dumb landing page you built in a design workshop that you're showing to a user. Yeah. There's like this moment of like, oh no, I worked on this, and what if someone thinks it isn't good?
Yeah.
And so I think it's important actually to acknowledge that for yourself. Like, it's not going to feel easy. It's particularly not going to feel easy when it's your career.
Yeah.
I agree with Susan's earlier points of thinking about risk, thinking about lighter weight ways of prototyping, thinking about prototyping that actually has no consequence and is just you articulating to yourself, like drawing out this odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it's okay to acknowledge that prototyping makes you feel uncomfortable, but that's for a good reason.
Mm-hmm. The one connection it's drawing for me is that often when we're doing like product or service prototyping with our clients, we have to tell them that the prototype is not always a smaller version of the final big thing. So sometimes the prototype is the small version of the big thing, but often when we're prototyping, we have different intentions. We're exploring different things through the prototype. So we could be exploring certain qualities or certain attributes or certain properties. And so it makes me think that for some of these bigger leaps that can feel scary, is there something about fear or uncertainty that we can test, right? Can we go live abroad? Can we have a more intense volunteering position? Can we join a board? Can we go down to 3 days a week or 4 days a week? Like, what are all the levers we have? And I think if we can actually use the tools of design to get very vivid descriptions of what we think we're moving towards, we can also apply the tool of analogous research and say, okay, like, well, if this is the thing, then how can I learn about it by this other thing? And that can be a very inspiring way to make progress as well. So it's not always about tackling the thing head on. Sometimes it's actually about a metaphorical or a kind of an analogous way to explore something.
Interesting. I also keep hearing, like, within the questions that there's like this idea that you prototype until you decide, and then you like launch yourself into something and you kind of stop prototyping. And I don't think it's like you're prototyping every day with every role at a full-time job or not, prototyping how you feel about what you're doing day to day. So think of it more as an active muscle that you're using all the time, rather than one thing that will lead you to like this very huge, massive decision.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question before we have to leave, but really like the thoughts on designing around families, partners. Like, do you design a journey with another person? Do you design your journey and incorporate someone else? How do you think about incorporating people who are, key to your odysseys?
Tough question. It was funny when I was doing this exercise. And I'm a very work to code person, but I was like, where does like my family fit in? Like, if I want to have kids, do I put that on this map? Like, how should I like put in my partner? Like, should my husband's career be like a sub bullet? I'm actually really curious, Susan, when you've done this with partners who might be making trade-offs or trying to understand particular moments where maybe someone's stepping forward and someone's stepping back, or things like that. Like, how do you actually do that?
It's a great question. So I haven't led a couple or a family through this activity. I've done it with individuals in a firm, which helps us then prioritize those questions that need to be true. I think there's definitely a way that you could do this together. I think it's also probably a really fun activity to do as a couple separately and then together, because what I think would happen is there'll be assumptions or states of, what great could look like in the future that you actually want to dial back from. So, there might be something about your lifestyle or your family or kids or God knows what that is kind of a beacon in the future that you want to work back from. And I think articulating what are the qualities that make that real and exciting and awesome versus what are the things that don't matter. And so I think actually that using your values and really painting a very vivid picture of the future is an amazing thing for friends to do, partners, husbands, wives, all the things. I would say that Maite's flashing up our reading list here. This last article from the New York Times a couple of months ago has some phenomenal tools about using decision weighting and values to make really big life choices. So it's very similar to the approach we discussed on the call. And this is one that I think they talk about using it inside your company, but I actually think you could probably use it in your family too.
It makes me think that like one of the activities to do here, along with like doing a map like this, is also like understanding what your constraints truly are, and really trying to get to the reality of that. One of my favorite professors in business school, Noam Wasserman, he talked a lot about how often you make micro choices and you sort of lock yourself into a life that's really hard to untangle yourself from. So it makes me think, I think this is true doing this individually, but it's definitely true doing it as a couple or as a family, that you need to like think through and do this iteratively and over time and understand what new constraints are cropping up that maybe didn't exist, when you first went about this, that now all of a sudden do, and then designing around.
Yeah, and one last build on that is that often with corporations where there's a lot of complexity, there's all this stuff about the future and it's very overwhelming. A very simple structure I'll use is, what's awesome, what's acceptable, and what's unacceptable. And let's actually try to have 3 buckets of like, really fantastic, what would we love to happen? What's also pretty good? What would be fine if it happened? And what do we think is unthinkable and unbearable? And actually having a very clear articulation of what those things are can help a group have consensus about what they're moving toward. And it's very simple but very powerful to just articulate things and write them on the wall or write them on a list and get them out and have everybody feel like that's a shared mind together.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Excited to hear thoughts on your own Odysseys, and really thank you IDEO Co-Lab, Susan and Becca, for sharing their time and their knowledge. And thank you all for logging in. Looking forward to seeing you.
Thank you, Maite, for making this happen, and thank you to Via.
Awesome. Thank you.
Happy designing.
Happy designing.
Bye-bye.
Bye.